So now we'll turn it over to Elly, who will share some information about myths surrounding legal prostitution in Germany.
So I'm here to talk about legal prostitution, and I'm a feminist from Germany, so a lot of my research into this area has been local, but I'm finding, looking at other countries with similar laws like Austria, Switzerland, or even New Zealand or parts of Australia that are often painted as a different kind of approach, sometimes called decrim, that really at the end of the day, those are hugely similar approaches to the sex trade. And those who want to read the details of the sources, there is a report by the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. I'll share a link later to that as well, but I'll give an overview of what I mean. Because, yeah, Germany has sort of fallen out of favor. Many might know we're nicknamed the brothel of Europe, but parts, Australian states or New Zealand are often presented as a great alternative. So I'll talk about what these have in common that's important to know regarding prostitution law. So, I should quickly say that I'm not going to go into feminist alternatives to the dichotomy of prohibition and legalization. That's for another time. But yeah, I'll just focus on legalization for now. I think most people who approach the prostitution issue can agree that we want women decriminalized, but it matters how we do that. And under the legalization or decrim model, they become workers. And the idea is, well, a worker will mean that these women can work legally. They will no longer be hounded by authorities, arrested, abused, which many countries have a very shameful history of that. But the reality is a lot more complicated because there are many ways that criminalization continues in countries like Germany or New Zealand. So just because the act of selling sex, if we want to call it that, becomes legal doesn't mean that there aren't still a lot of arrests, fines, prosecutions around migration. And we know that impoverished migrant women go to wealthier countries. A lot of them are, well, there's both trafficked women and economic refugees from Eastern Europe to Germany or from Asia to New Zealand and Australia. They still suffer the consequences of the laws around that and can't access their rights due to their migration status. Then we know the presence of drugs is still an issue. Instead of viewing a woman in prostitution who might have a little bit of coke or who's doing some low-level dealing as a victim of an exploitative system, she's seen, as a criminal. And there are still no-go zones. Many people don't know. Actually, most of Germany and also significant parts of New Zealand, you cannot sell sex, not around, schools, kindergartens, churches, residential areas. Often it's the industrial area or, well, sometimes the poor part of town or infamously, areas around train stations. But otherwise, we still have prohibitions, and these women can, if they're in the wrong area, can still be punished. We often hear about child removal in, Nordic model countries, but this is a global issue that still continues. There's still a lot of children being removed from mothers, and about half of women in prostitution are mothers, and a lot of them fear seeking help because they know other women who've lost custody. And furthermore, there are new types of criminalization that come with legalization, depressingly, ironically. For example, there are women who cannot exit the sex trade because they are tax indebted to the state. Because as a worker, of course, she must pay tax. Some countries, such as Austria, also have mandatory health checkups. So women have to still undergo this, I think, quite old, often barbaric practice of being examined against their will intimately. And if they're found to be sick, a lot of them are just deported. And there's mandatory condom use that women can be fined for. And finally, I think the COVID pandemic showed how quickly legalization can slip back into prohibition. So a lot of countries with strict social distancing rules just straight up criminalized the women who were so desperate that during a pandemic, they continued to sell sex. And this is because, well, they're workers, so they must have savings, so they can just apply for benefits. That's not really how it works for most women. So that leads us into the next idea, the idea that women gain some kind of labor rights, and that prostitution is regulated by labor law, and they have all these protections, and then they can enact their rights and protections better against the whims of Johns and pimps. And the reality is much more of a really, really horrible gig economy. So women do not actually have these great detailed contracts with brothels about all their rights and health, etc., but they're independent contractors. And so some women don't have contracts at all. They're just straight up black market workers. There's still a huge black market that continues, but even an independent contractor, saving money so that she can afford a vacation, a sick or a maternal leave is up to her. She has to take care of that. And as I mentioned, a lot of the migrant women, the law is written, it imagines the woman as this, strong, independent, self-sufficient woman who has a tax consultant and a lawyer. That's not the reality of the average woman in the sex trade. She's far more likely to slide ever deeper into debt. And there's a huge lack of exit programs because, of course, if sex workers work, why would you need help to leave it? And there even is quite a phenomenon of women living in the rooms where they are selling sex. So they're dependent just for basic shelter on brothel owners, which is a very, very dangerous place to be. And there are very few regulations around things like prices or shift length. And we do know that with legalization, as it becomes even more culturally normal than it is previously, more men want to buy sex, but there isn't a sudden rise of women who want to sell. So both, poverty, migration, and trafficking comes in to fill that demand, and prices plummet. So there are actually places in Germany, and I believe in other countries as well, where you can pay women for sex acts in coins. That's how little it can be. And just overall, even if we take trafficking out of the picture, legal prostitution means we say it's okay for women's sexual intimate boundaries to be subject to market forces. So not her personal desires or how she's feeling today decides whether, for example, she will use a condom or won't, will offer anal sex or won't. It'll be how big is the competition, how much more does she need to pay room rent today, etc. A lot of people imagine that when the sex trade becomes legal, society increases their respect for women. Now, to be fair, a lot of the countries whose legislation I'm critiquing, these laws are only about 2 decades old. So you could say, okay, let's give people time. But nonetheless, there are some worrying trends emerging. Actually, how the reframing of the woman from criminal to worker creates new types of stigma. So I often find it important to emphasize acceptance of prostitution does not equal acceptance of the women themselves, even though, like I said, we can still watch and wait because it's only been a few decades. I do observe, especially in my country, but I'm seeing this elsewhere also, that there are new types of stigma emerging, specifically from the idea that this is just labor. And so many people still have this old-fashioned view, women in the sex trade, they are home wreckers or they're born deviants. It's a very, very old idea. Patriarchal philosophers throughout time came up with these ideas that women are born nymphomaniacs, and that's why, it's fine to subject them to this industry. And this view is still very much around. But under legalization, it takes new form. Specifically the idea that women in the sex trade serve as sponges for male violence, as rape fodder, as I call it. I know that's a drastic term, but that's very much what people mean. The attitude that if we have these sexually aggressive men, we don't really know what to do with them. Well, if we can send them to brothels, we'll calm them a little bit. So this idea of men as pressure cookers, essentially, and some group of women will have to be sacrificed, essentially. And this is where a lot of the support for brothels comes from, this exact idea. I hear this from people all the time, including women. And it culminates, I wrote an article for the feminist magazine Redux about this specifically. So this is all sourced and confirmed, that there are these psychological treatment facilities that treat sex offenders, rapists, and they will use women in prostitution to teach men about consent. So he actually gets to practice on her body, because, now she's some kind of healer but really she's still an other. And yeah, we're fine with putting her in danger. And then very depressingly, a lot of sex trade survivors can testify that in countries like Germany and New Zealand, if they say prostitution and what men did to me traumatized me, they're told, well, look, a lot of women like this, a lot of women choose this, and you just happen to be in the wrong job. And I'm sorry you had a bad experience, but there's nothing wrong with the system, so it must be you, the individual. And connected to this, the idea that, the way that Johns behave towards women will change, that if they just view them as service providers rather than, my secret dirty hobby that's kind of illegal, they will treat them better as well. And if the idea again that there'll be fewer criminal elements, which I'll get to in a bit, then also Johns will be more relaxed and calm and just easier to deal with. And the reality is what survivors tell us. So there's some women who lived the transition from, a prohibitionist model or a more tightly regulated model to this more legal free-for-all, who tell us that actually John's entitlement escalates. And there's a lot of evidence for this. First of all, again, very, very few legal limits on what a John can do. Any fetish that he has, any kind of way that women are objectified and dehumanized, is normalized. It's an integral part of the trade. If you go on a sex trade advertising site where women put up profiles, there's a huge emphasis on her age, including barely legal, on her skin color, ethnicity, race. Unbelievably, I'll explain in a second all the terms. I'm just seeing the questions come into the chat. So that's fine. This is the only industry where you can choose your service provider by her skin color, and obviously any kind of body type that you can imagine is fetishized. And the range of sexual practices that men can do to women is quite shocking. I don't think even our legislators know about that, or they don't want to know. Now, to be fair, a lot of the things that I will list could be done in a relationship as well. And we do a lot of activism around, that these would actually be signs of domestic violence, like a tendency for strangulation, etc. But yeah, when he can't get it from the woman at home, there's always a woman at the brothel or an escorting, etc., that he can do it to. So those would be practices such as gangbangs that people might know from pornography. So a group of men all, I believe, sexually abusing a woman after each other, popularized by pornography, but also these flat rate or all-inclusive offers. So flat rate is he pays once and then he can go with as many women as he wants. And there are really, reports of men queuing outside brothels for offers such as this, or all-inclusive. So he pays once and then he can do with her whatever he likes. And finally, esclavia is a term that they use in the German sex trade for the opposite of a dominatrix. So that's a woman who will have to submit to a sadistic man's whims. And that can include severe bodily harm, acts of torture, such as, I'll just list a few, that's skin cutting, electrocution, making her consume urine or feces. And he can call it sex work, and this will be legal. And brothel owners don't really serve to protect women. They are there to protect their bottom line, and they're often complaint managers for the Johns rather than the women. And we don't have a lot of great data because even collecting statistics on violence in the sex trade is considered by many to be stigmatizing. So just to talk about violence is somehow encouraging it. This is a very frustrating development that we also have to fight as feminists. But a lot of the evidence does show us that physical, sexual, and lethal violence, so murder in the sex trade, is very, very often committed by a John. Often a dissatisfied customer feels, I paid, therefore I am owed, and if she doesn't do what I want, I get to shout at her, belittle her, complain to the pimp, slap her across the face, and worse. And the rate of prosecution of these crimes is still very low. We know it's low for rape and abuse for all women, but this group of women still very much so. Their rates are disproportionately higher to other women in society. There's the idea that legalization will be better able to help women around their health issues. They'll be more likely to tell a doctor that they're in the sex trade, and more likely to seek at least medical help. So it's true that there are some anonymous services for women, but as the sex trade expands, and I mentioned the competition worsens, again, women are enduring a lot of things physically and emotionally that are actually even worse than before. So the sex trade is still deadly. And for anyone who doubts this, I always recommend go and read the sex work occupational hazard guidelines from the pro-prostitution lobby or from pro-prostitution organizations. They're very, very disturbing. Again, very few legal protections for women who are very young, heavily pregnant, disabled, ill, addicted, or homeless. And there's, these guides will teach women, how to safely use needles for drug injection, or advice like this. And there's still a lot of illness, a lot of suicide, and women who survive. They call themselves survivors because there's a myriad of ways that prostitution can prematurely end your life. And many women live with lifelong health problems. And again, reading the material can be quite disturbing because it lists, possibly lethal health outcomes and also psychological symptoms that sound like PTSD. But as one survivor, I think it was Chelsea Geddes, said, but it'll be headlined with terms such as sex worker burnout. Yeah, so one of the big mantras of the pro-prostitution movement is, let's legalize consenting adults in the sex trade, because then we can go after the real criminals. And the reality is, because a lot of the acts of pimps become legal, it actually becomes easier to traffic rather than harder. So the legal definition of trafficking is drastically narrowed. In Germany, pimping is legal, only exploitative pimping is legal. So there's a very, very heavy burden of proof on the individual victim to say, okay, so I was forced into this, they made me do specific sex acts with specific men, her being poor, or like I mentioned, homeless, mentally ill, sick, it does not matter. She has to prove very, very concrete coercion, otherwise they are legal sex trade profiteers. And it becomes harder. And again, I know the police is not women's friends. I understand the police is a patriarchal institution as well, and a lot of women have very negative experience with police. Unfortunately, currently, I don't know who else to call when there's the presence of the Hells Angels or similar organizations. So their investigations and later the prosecutions become a lot more difficult, again, due to these laws. New Zealand, for example, hasn't prosecuted a single trafficker since it decriminalized the sex trade. And so actually the legal brothel becomes a great place to traffic both adults and minors. In New Zealand, for example, you can't even check the papers and IDs at brothels without, a specific warrant. So legal brothels become a great place to traffic somebody too. And we have a few cases where they did actually, in Germany, the Paradise brothel is the famous case where they were able to track that the brothel owners knew about these trafficking streams into their business. But a lot of the time, they get away with it. Then there's the rhetoric that, those of us who have not experienced prostitution or not currently in it, we shouldn't talk so much about the trade because it doesn't affect us. Okay, so maybe we have to consider, safe sex practices. Those are encouraged by by a legal sex trade. That's great. And then the general public has nothing to worry about. And the reality is that there are a number of detrimental effects in society. So there is actually still men who really, really don't want to use condoms and will absolutely pass on STIs to their girlfriends and wives. A lot of Johns are married. And also the emotional trauma that happens to women when they've been cheated on many, many times, I think is actually not a small issue. And just finally, to wrap up, legal prostitution really undermines the social standing of all women and girls, but especially poor and working class, migrant women, women of color, who staff most of the sex trade, because there's just this view of a lot of men based on the skin color, or just being female and walking around at night, or being a woman in a service job. I can ask her to come with me to the hotel room to make a little extra money. And this is something that a lot of women have experienced, including myself. So this harassment just becomes normal. And how can we have women's liberation when men view us as commodities just because we're female?
Are many Ukrainian women trafficked into German brothels?
There are huge concerns around this. As soon as the war started, there were women's rights activists ringing the alarm bells, and a little bit belated, German authorities started sharing information at train stations, flyers or posters telling women, if anyone approaches you with a dubious job offer, etc., here's where to go. So they did act, but even the experts say that reality is we won't know how much this is happening until a few months, years down the road, when the survivors come to us and tell us, really. Well, we probably won't ever be able to fully quantify. I didn't mention this in my talk, but currently we don't even know how many women are in the sex trade in Germany. I think about a little over 20,000 are registered, but even low estimates say it's more like 50,000 to 200,000. So not even just the Ukrainian refugees. We don't even know how many women in general are in the trade. It's so hard to track, even when it's legal. There are some people on the lookout for the victimization of Ukrainian women, and the Johns in their forums, or some of them celebrated the arrival, of young mothers with children desperate for some stability. But yeah, depressingly, we won't know until down the line. But there was a little bit more awareness in news and just German society that maybe brothels aren't a great place to send women to. There are some people on the lookout for the victimization of Ukrainian women, and the Johns in their forums, or some of them celebrated the arrival, of young mothers with children desperate for some stability. But yeah, depressingly, we won't know until down the line. But there was a little bit more awareness in news and just German society that maybe brothels aren't a great place to send women to. There's a question if I can discuss Germany's connection and power within the European Union to set standards throughout Europe. So I am not as familiar with the exact laws there, but there are a lot of European and international conventions that want to fight human trafficking, and Germany is one of the countries that's always blocking because it would violate our prostitution law. So Germany is really, even stopping progress in international agreements. This happens frequently. And on the other hand, if Germany were to, which I didn't talk about today, I assume many women are familiar with the Nordic model. Otherwise, have a look at the website Nordic Model Now. So I think feminist alternative to prohibition legalization, if Germany were to go that route, of course, that would have huge ripple effects. There's been a debate in Spain for some time. So I think the current Spanish government is somewhat positive towards the Nordic model approach, because after us, Spain is the second biggest brothel of Europe, I guess. But yeah, that hasn't been in the media as much as we would like, and we don't know if it'll actually go through. There are some developments in Germany, so the sex trade survivors are getting more and more organized and getting more and more screen time on TV, which it takes a huge toll on these women. So they really need all the support they can get, because people, they want to hear from someone personally affected, and which of course, those women have to be included, but that also puts all the burden on them to do this kind of activism. So there's some progress there. We're getting more and more support from different political coalitions. So both Conservatives, Labour, German Greens, but it could still be, could still be a while before we actually get a law change. There isn't a proposal. There is now, I think, a governmental group where the supporters of the Nordic model organize together, but there's still a clear minority. And we're very, very slowly changing public opinion.